Greetings fellow noob, today we find ourselves on Surf Zeitgeist. Making a guide on this map was suggested to me by Nathan from the Momentum Mod team, who said it's a good introduction to tech surf. That got me thinking that this video could be a little more than just a walkthrough and instead a somewhat wider insight into tech surf, not just pointing out how to beat every single stage, but also find some themes and motifs that are common to tech in general, and overall get a better idea of how to approach tech as a subgenre of surf. So without further ado, let's see what we can learn from this map. And we find the first of those things already at the very beginning of stage 1, where we have this overhanging start platform over this heavily declining first ramp. Now, this is a very recognizable motif that you're going to find on a lot of tech maps, also other maps, but especially tech maps. More often than not, the optimal approach is to leave the start platform to the front with a turn-binded 360, so you kind of go backwards a little bit and reach the first ramp higher. The main obstacle of stage 1 is of course this little ramp in the middle with this ledge in front of it. Think about how easy the stage would be if this ledge didn't exist. Weird ramps like this aren't somehow magical, the same physics of surf still apply. You want to leave the first ramp a little early to avoid the ledge and then try and get as parallel of a board as possible. And then this ramp can bump you over the wall, and if you then get a somewhat okay board on the last ramp, reaching the end zone shouldn't be a big problem. So this is the straightforward solution to this stage, but depending on how you count, there's at least 4 more. There are faster and harder ones, and some are pretty pointless, just kinda interesting. And I think one of the coolest things about tech surf is when it gives you so many different solutions to the same problem, especially if some of them are a bit obscure and difficult to spot, like here. It sort of adds an element of discovery and problem solving that you don't find in unit surf in quite the same way. And while here the most straightforward approach is probably also the easiest, that's not always the case, so it's definitely worth to keep your eyes open for alternatives. Stage 2 introduces one of the most common tech challenges, which is to board a ramp during or straight after a sharp turn, and then also leaving it very quickly at the correct angle. I'm not sure if there's a specific word for it, but that's basically what's happening on the screen right now. The way I'm doing it here is with fairly fast turnbinds, and that's certainly one way to do it. But when you look at more experienced and specialized tech surfers, you're usually gonna see them using only small turnbinds or even no turnbinds at all. The thing about turnbinds is of course that they are either on or off, so while they put you at an exact turn rate instantly, they don't work that well for fine adjustments, which is usually what you want when boarding a ramp. So how do they do it then? Most people are going to say sensitivity. But while it's true that tech surfers tend to have higher sensitivity, it's usually not that high, and it's also not all tech surfers. Some play at very low sensitivity too. So sense can be part of the answer, but it's not the main answer. The main answer instead is mouse positioning, especially resetting your mouse and being comfortable with making very large mouse movements. And at some point during my surf journey, I more or less forgot that you can reset your mouse, and that's why I became so reliant on big turnbinds to surf something like this, which isn't necessarily bad, because turning is turning, but it's a blind spot in my movement pattern that I didn't develop consciously, and that's certainly limiting me in some cases, and that I'll try to slowly get rid of in the future. Stage 3 is overall quite simple and short, but there's at least a little bit of a trick to it at the end. But starting at the beginning, you want to board the first ramp really low and flatten out quickly so you avoid the head hit, go a bit wide here if you can, and then you have this really exaggerated ramp strafe. Now, doing the ramp strafe is the fastest way, but there is actually a different and easier solution hidden in plain sight here. This is a fairly niche motif in tech, so I think most players miss it. This is the one other example I could think of where this comes up. Stage 4 has a fairly interesting circular 3-dimensional routing and architecture. Together with a few obstacles, this creates a continuous theme. You have to resist the usual urge to go down on ramps to gather speed and instead board high and stay high on every single ramp. Once you've realized that, the stage is mostly a mechanical challenge. On stage 5, we encounter the most stereotypically tech map design element of them all, the Spinnydrop, Or, well, at least sort of. The straightforward way to do this section is interpreting it as a spinny drop, but technically it's more a downward weave and it can be played as such too. The end then is an upward weave, and here there's really no room for interpretation. Stage 6 is, according to the KSF data, the stage where the most players fail the map. It certainly isn't easy, but I think the reason why so many players fail here is because they misinterpret it as a mechanical challenge rather than a routing challenge. Basically, you get into this room full of obstacles and you think if you just somehow navigate them well enough, you're gonna make it. But the main problem isn't really the obstacles, it's that we are simply too fast for our own good. And that is a pretty common theme in tech too. It's not always just about more speed, but controlling your speed. Now, there isn't really a good way to slow down here, so the trick is to control your trajectory instead. An early head hit can help, or staying high on the previous ramp and leaving it somewhat early. But funnily enough, the fastest route is actually the one that never gets fast in the first place. You simply skip the part that speeds you up. For the last ramp, the one thing that matters is that you board it high. Other than that, it's just about units and timing. On stage 7, we encounter a similar problem. Again, our trajectory and speed don't really match the obstacle. This time, however, we have a lot more space we can use to kind of delay our entry underneath the glass ceiling, board the last ramp as far back as possible, and then leave it at a somewhat specific angle. Stage 8 again starts with some weirdly shaped but mostly benevolent ramps. For the last ramp, make sure you approach it from below, and then it works very similar to the end of stage 6. On a narrative level, this stage is the payoff of a lot of foreshadowing. We've actually encountered this ramp several times before, and we also see a highly suboptimal strat from stage 1 suddenly reappear and being very viable. On stage 9, we find one of the worst motifs in tech, the AIDS booster, and on top of that, ramp strafes and another really awkward board from above. All of that creates a really toxic combination and makes this by far my least favorite stage on this map. There's no real trick to it, I don't think, it's just bad. For stage 10, there isn't something super particular to point out, so I'll use this time to talk about something else, and that's Prestrafes. One common misconception about Prestrafes is that people intuitively associate them with unit surf and saving 0.05 seconds on Boreas or whatever. But I think it's exactly a map like Zeitgeist where Prestrafes have the biggest practical impact. That's not mainly because of faster runs, but because they make the map easier. You don't need them, but the extra units you gain from a Prestrafe compensate for a suboptimal board or some other small mistake. On a 12-stage map, you don't get that cushion once, you get it at the start of every stage. That's why I think learning a basic Prestrafe as you get into Tier 3 Surf is a really good idea. Not a great Prestrafe, just a simple, basic one. It makes a lot of maps easier, especially tech maps. Stage 11 is the most elaborate stage, and it falls under the broad category of jank. The main question is what to do inside of this strange tube. You can try and maintain speed by awkwardly spinning, but it shouldn't be necessary. To do this somewhat consistently, it's enough to firmly align yourself with one side of the tube, because as you exit it, you need to do a little flick to the other side to gain some forward speed and make it onto the last platform. That's really the main trick to this stage. The goal is to hit the B-hop not too far back, flick over the ramp, and have that catapult you into the end zone. So once you know what to do, it's really not that bad. There is, however, layers to this shit. About half of the stage can be skipped. Needless to say, this is really hard, and I was never able to do this exact route outside of savelog. On Momentum Mod, however, this skip gets a lot easier because you can use the start booster twice. On KSF you can't do that. Now, the way boosters usually work is that they give you speed in a certain direction, so basically you have to face in the right direction when hitting them. So I experimented with using a Turnbind that would give me a perfect 360-degree rotation during a jump. It quickly turned out that this is hugely impractical and also not really optimal. I got way better results by using a 300 yaw speed Turnbind and some mouse movement. So the Turnbind thing was a dead end, but as I was testing it, I noticed something much more interesting. And let me warn you, because now we are entering a deep, deep rabbit hole. Let's slow things down and take a close look at the speedometer. Early on during our spin, we see that we lose some units to air strafing, which is normal and expected, but then something strange happens. Although our turn rate stays exactly the same, we suddenly start bleeding units much faster. And that's the complete opposite of what should happen. As we slow down, turning at the same rate should cause us to lose fewer units, not more. And it gets even weirder because at some point this effect also suddenly stops. All of a sudden we are back to only losing very few units. So what in all hell is happening here? It's not a bug, but it's not that far from it. It's one of the most bizarre quirks of Source movement. For some incredibly mysterious reason, the Source engine applies a heavy air acceleration penalty whenever our vertical velocity is between 0 and positive 140 units. In other words, while we are going upwards very slowly, just like towards the apex of our jump. To explain this a bit further, what is actually being penalized is our air acceleration cap, which is itself a rather peculiar thing. Put somewhat technically, the air axle cap limits how much our velocity can change with every single tick, and therefore how fast we are actually turning. Our camera has no problem turning at 490 degrees per second, no matter how fast we move. It will happily rotate exactly as fast as we ask it to. And as it moves, the strafe commands we are continuously issuing by holding D travel with it, constantly applying acceleration to the right. But the direction of our velocity is separate from both. And because we've now crossed the air axle cap, our velocity can no longer keep up. In a sort of Chernobyl-esque runaway effect, the direction of our current velocity and the direction in which we are accelerating by strafing travel further and further apart. Increasingly, they begin to point in opposite ways. So to the game, it is as if we are trying to go increasingly backwards. And of course, there's no quicker way to lose your units than going backwards. When we reach the apex of our jump, our z velocity drops below 0. The speedometer says it's increasing, but it's a negative value because now we are falling. Suddenly, the z-vel penalty is lifted, and ironically, this is where the biggest catastrophe happens. In a single tick, the game can now finally resolve the built-up mismatch, and within that single tick, we lose almost 100 units. Only after this violent correction, we are back to regular air strafing. The z-vel penalty always applies when we are between 0 and 140 positive vertical velocity, but usually we are not fast enough and turning fast enough to actually exceed the reduced air axle cap, so it has no practical effect. Where it can suddenly matter a lot is if another such penalty stacks on top of it, and one such penalty is caused by crouching. Together, they reduce the air axle cap so much that you can exceed it even at relatively modest speeds and turn rates. This is, by the way, the main reason why being crouched on a ramp is often quite iffy. I'll probably cover that more thoroughly at another point. Here, I mostly found it a cool thing to showcase because you usually don't get to see it in such a controlled environment, and it's perhaps quite fitting that the janky stage reveals such a janky mechanic. Stage 12 doesn't really introduce anything super new, it's more like a final exam that combines a lot of the things we've seen throughout the map. It's not easy, but if you could beat the previous stages, I think you can beat this one too. Hopefully this guide didn't just help you to beat Surf Zeitgeist, but also gave you a few ideas that carry over to other tech maps, and maybe even some new ways of thinking about tech surf in general. I certainly learned a lot while making it, not least due to the efforts of these two handsome individuals who answered a lot of the questions I had about stages 2 and 11, so big thanks to them. That's it, have a good one, see ya!